So, first, we are going to jump into the recent Supreme Court case, Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard. In this case has received a ton of media attention as it has touched on and affected affirmative action, a principle that has been in place in the United States legal system for many decades. Affirmative action is a principle that allows colleges, universities, which this case specifically applies to, but also businesses and other organizations to consider race, to consider the racial identity of a person in making a decision as to whether or not to admit them to college or admit them into the organization or give them employment. So we're going to dive into this. Again, this is Joe the Lawyer. If you like my content, please like, subscribe, comment, and share. Sign up for my email list. I'm going to start here with the Wikipedia page. Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard. Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard is a landmark decision of the United States Supreme Court in which the court held that race-based affirmative action programs in college admissions processes violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. With its companion case, Students for Fair Admissions versus University of North Carolina, the Supreme Court effectively overruled Grutter versus Bollinger and Regents of the University of California versus Bakke, which validated some affirmative action in college admissions, provided that race had a limited role in decisions. The 14th Amendment was passed post-slavery. It has a lot in it, but most importantly, it has an equal protection clause, which has been interpreted. And remember, the 14th Amendment was passed in the 1800s. It was passed in the 19th century. This is an old law. It's over 100 years old. It's been in the Constitution. And it's been interpreted to prevent entities, colleges, businesses, organizations, clubs, the government, from discriminating on the basis of race. So from denying people certain rights based on their race. And I'll get into affirmative action a little bit. Let's do a little bit more background on the case. This particular case involved Harvard University's undergraduate admissions process. Students for Fair Admissions, an organization led by conservative legal strategist Edward Bloom, represented a group of anonymous Asian Americans rejected from Harvard. After a brief pause spurred by the ruling in Fisher v. University, the District Court for the District of Massachusetts ruled Harvard's admissions process does not discriminate against Asian Americans. SFFA, the organization, petitioned the Supreme Court in 2021. Supreme Court granted both cases certiorari, which means the right to be heard before the United States Supreme Court, and consolidated them under Harvard in January 2022. But following the appointment of Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, a member of the Harvard Board of Overseers at the time, the cases were split, with Jackson recusing from the Harvard case while participating in the North Carolina one. She has a conflict of interest, having served on the board in Harvard, so Justice Ketanji Brown can't be part of the decision in the particular Harvard case. On June 29, 2023, the Supreme Court issued a decision that, by a vote of 6-2, reversed the lower court ruling. Remember, the court in Massachusetts said that the affirmative action program was okay. In writing the majority opinion, Chief Justice John Roberts held affirmative action in college admissions is unconstitutional. The court did not decide whether race-based affirmative action can continue in U.S. military academies, which the Solicitor General, and that's the attorney for the government, urged the court to continue to allow in the government's amicus brief. Very briefly, let's look at exactly what affirmative action is, just so we get an understanding here. Affirmative action, in the context of the allocation of resources or employment, the practice or policy of favoring individuals belonging to groups regarded as disadvantaged or subject to discrimination. So the 14th Amendment, remember, the gist of it, and this is likely what those who oppose this decision would argue, is that it's supposed to stop companies, businesses, the government, organizations from excluding somebody because of their race. Exclusion. Affirmative action is different. Affirmative action doesn't work by excluding people. It works by giving preference to people. So it's more of a positive concept. It gives preference to people based on their race. So, prior to this decision, universities were allowed to say if they had two individuals that were equal in all other aspects, let's say a white individual and a black individual, the universities were able to say, well, the fact that this person's black gives them one extra point, therefore we're going to give admission to this person over the white person. One of the interesting things about this case, though, is it actually is based on Asian Americans being excluded from universities because the concept outside of affirmative action is meritocracy or merit-based. Merit-based decision making says, regardless of somebody's race, gender, ethnicity, whatever attributes that they may have, that universities, companies, organizations should only be looking at the merit. GPA for colleges. What organizations was the person in? Did the person volunteer? Where have they worked? Life experience in the work field, things like that, in order, test scores most prominently. And then whoever has the highest scores based on those should get in, irregardless of race, sex, gender. And affirmative action kind of puts a little crimp on merit-based because it does allow universities to consider, as one amongst many factors, race as a factor. And Asian Americans generally, and I believe this is true only because I've read up on this in the past, they tend to get the highest test scores in the United States, and they tend to have the highest GPAs. So the top universities are generally going to, if it's strictly merit-based, they would be allowing Asian Americans at a much higher percentage rate than white Americans or black Americans or Hispanic Americans or Americans of any other gender. They just tend to outperform in all those merit-based statistics. So they were the group that was being hurt the most by affirmative action. Now, I'm going to roll down here because there is a lot to this case, and hours and hours could probably be spent on it. But I think I can get the point across if we just look at the opinions, okay? And remember, what the court is doing here is they're applying the 14th Amendment to this affirmative action. And what they're saying is see, the 14th Amendment doesn't discriminate between a sort of positive race-based decisions or negative race-based decisions, right? So remember, it was passed to stop businesses, government organizations from excluding people of color. But the 14th Amendment is neutral. It just says you cannot discriminate. You cannot give preference. And so, what the court had done in the 1970s is sort of when affirmative action was challenged is, they said it's okay. They said it's okay under the 14th Amendment because it's sort of a positive thing with affirmative action, and it's one factor amongst many. So they allowed it. Plus, based on historical discrimination in the United States, that this was a measure, this is something that the court should allow despite the language in the 14th Amendment. So let's look at the opinions. Both Harvard and North Carolina were decided jointly on June 29th, 2023, with the court ruling race-based admissions adopted by both Harvard and UNC were unconstitutional under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Jackson recused herself in Harvard, making its decision based on a 6-2 vote, while she joined the dissents in North Carolina, resulting in a 6-3 vote. The decision stated that race cannot be a conscious factor in admissions to universities. It did not stop universities from considering a student's race so long as that decision is concretely tied to a quality of character or unique ability that the particular applicant can contribute to the university. So let me say this, I don't have a crystal ball. I am an attorney. I'm not a constitutional scholar, although I'm a baby constitutional scholar. This could be a bit of a linchpin here that allows universities to still consider race. So possibly what this decision has done, and we'll see the impact over a course of years, is not eliminate affirmative action in the decisions of universities when selecting students, but instead is just taken some of the wind out of it, made it not as strong, whereas previously they could consider race and it didn't have to be tied to any other factors. Well, now if they want to consider race, it does have to be tied to another factor, so long as the discussion is concretely tied to a quality of character or unique ability. So that to me is very interesting, and it may mean that affirmative action isn't completely dead, despite what you heard in the media. Now, understand Supreme Court decisions, they have to be litigated and interpreted over time in order to understand their true impact. So, it's always best to take a deep breath when a decision comes down and to kind of wait and see what happens. And I'm not saying they aren't impactful. It's certainly impactful. And some of them may be impactful in a way that when people thought they weren't impactful. But this one may not be as impactful, this is my take from this language, as many of the people in the media are saying. It might still allow, it appears to still allow universities to consider race if they can concretely tie it. So probably reduce the number of race-based admissions, but I don't believe it's going to eliminate that factor completely. Majority opinion. Representing majority opinion, Justice Roberts wrote, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment applies without regard to any difference of race, of color, of nationality, and thus must apply to every person. As such, eliminating racial discrimination means eliminating all of it, even if it's in a preference-based method. Adding that for the guarantee of equal protection cannot mean one thing when applied to one individual and something else when applied to a person of another color. Roberts wrote, the affirmative action programs lack sufficiently focused and measurable objectives warranting the use of race. Unavoidably employ race in a negative manner, involve racial stereotyping, and lack meaningful endpoints. We have never permitted commissions programs to work in that way, and we will not do so today. And, sometimes the Supreme Court will change as history changes. And I believe one of the reasons that this decision was made in the first place is because of the long history of racial discrimination. And America still certainly has racial discrimination today. But I think you have to say that things have changed since the 1970s. And the fact that society's changed a lot in the last 50 years may have impacted this decision. Let's look at the dissent. In a dissenting opinion by Justice Kagan, Justice Sotomayor wrote that ignoring race will not equalize a society that is racially unequal. What was true in the 1860s and again in 1954 is true today. Equality requires acknowledgement of inequality. Sotomayor wrote, the majority's opinion, interpretation of the 14th Amendment is not only contrary to precedent and the entire teachings of our history, but is also grounded in the illusion that racial inequality was a problem of a different generation. And there's that historical aspect there. I think people can certainly, I think reasonable minds can disagree on what the progress has been in this country since the 1970s when this decision was originally made. Some may say very little progress. Some may say that there's been a lot of progress. But it appears that this court believes that there's been a lot of progress, which has removed some of the historical reasoning for allowing race-based admissions in universities, which the court did in the 1970s. So it will be very interesting to see how this plays out in the coming months, years, and with new Supreme Courts that come onto the bench. It will be an impactful decision. I'm going to say that it's not going to remove race completely as a factor. Universities are going to find a way to comply with the language of that law, okay, so that they can continue to consider it just as a single element. So I think that this case has taken a lot of the wind out of it, but I don't believe it has eliminated it completely. Thank you, everyone, for watching my video on Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, the historic affirmative action decision. If you like my content and analysis, please like, subscribe, comment, and share. It's a free way to support this channel. Also, sign up for my email list. You will get a free PDF on what to do when pulled over by the police. Thank you very much. Joe the Lawyer out.